Power up. Welcome to Energypreneurs, where I bring to you the exciting new opportunities in solar power, battery, and electric cars. I'm your host, Sohail Hasni. I have been tracking and analyzing these technologies on LinkedIn and Twitter for more than 10 years. Now we meet on podcast.
The challenges of solar power, obviously, is sun is not there all the time, but we need electricity all the time. And then came batteries, that changing everything. Today we discuss with Jeff Forrest about batteries and its impact on the overall energy transition, how this amazing technology from individual houses to on a large scale national grid, or even on the electric car, which is sort of like a battery on wheels, is going to impact and change the electricity industry as we know. We get into some detailed discussion of V2G, the vehicle to grid technology, and what is the future of all these technologies on our everyday life in the future to address climate change. Please join in to find more.
Good morning. Jeff,
Good morning.
how are you?
Very good, thank you.
Where are you today?
I'm in Sydney today. It's where one of our offices is based. Thank you so much for having me on the podcast. My name is Jeff Forrest. I'm a partner with L.E.K Consulting, which is a global consulting firm that works across a number of different industries. I lead the energy practice here in Australia, along with a couple of other partners. And so we're very focused on energy and particularly the decarbonization of the electricity sector. And that's the thing that gets me out of bed in the morning. It feels to me like the climate change challenge is the biggest challenge that we're facing as a civilization. And we need to be decarbonizing all of our activities, but the most obvious and the fastest moving is the electricity sector. And so that's where I'm focusing. And a big focus of our work recently has been on batteries and the role that batteries are going to play in supporting the decarbonization of the electricity grid. And so potentially that's a good topic for us to have a chat about.
Absolutely. So let's start.
A big focus of the work that we've been doing quite recently in our energy practice has been on understanding the role that batteries are going to be playing in the electricity grid. We work a lot with particularly grid owners and operators, so the transmission and distribution networks here in Australia. Mm-hmm. And it's really fascinating seeing how they're starting to think about the role of batteries in stabilizing the overall grid, both in terms of the unique ability of batteries and other energy storage technologies to time shift energy, so moving it from when it's being generated to when it's being stored, but also the role that energy storage can play in providing a bunch of other grid services. There's a lot of work that needs to happen behind the scenes in order to keep our grid stable and operating and delivering energy consistently. And batteries have a really fascinating role to play in all of that as well. And Sohail, it's interesting talking to people, particularly people outside the energy sector, who don't realize just how revolutionary the time-shifting ability of batteries really is. The electricity grid is the largest and most complex machine that we have in our society. It's a single interconnected machine. In Australia, it's a single interconnected machine that stretches from far north Queensland down to Tasmania and South Australia, if you think about the national electricity market being our largest grid. And prior to introducing significant amounts of energy storage, that entire machine needed to be in balance in terms of supply and demand instantaneously. And so the idea that you can take energy, particularly energy that's being generated from solar panels during the middle of the day, and store it and then re-export it at peak times in the evening may sound like not that much, but it's actually driving a revolution in the way that we're thinking about the energy system.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like analog photography to digital, right? Your ability to store suddenly, you can send it anywhere you want.
Yes.
Because when I joined State Electricity Commission of Victoria in late 80s, it was the state of a slide film, right? Life is defined. Latrobe Valley, that coal determines electricity. And now we are almost digitized, right? I know it's not a perfect comparison, but thinking wise, it's equally
Yes.
revolutionary.
Yes.
You mentioned the
Absolutely.
grid owners and operators. Of course, the grid owners and operators are going to see the maximum brunt of this change. Or grids are designed in one-way thinking. There's a bunch of power generation. All I have to do, carry them, bring it to the people who cannot grow their electricity. Now they are growing so much, it has to go both ways, no?
Yes, absolutely. And that's a big complicating factor in all of this, but it's also where we're really seeing batteries coming to the fore and you're starting to see more and more transmission and distribution networks investing in batteries directly. And I think there are a few drivers for that, or at least in the work that we've been doing, there are a few drivers for that. The first one is that the economics of batteries and of battery storage is changing quite rapidly, both on the revenue and the cost side. On the cost side, what we've been seeing is, while there's been a bit of variation year on year, the trend in battery costs is that they're coming down very rapidly in a similar way to what we saw with solar panel costs maybe 10, 15 years ago, where there was this really steep downward learning curve, partly driven by just us developing more sophisticated and lower cost ways of assembling batteries. But a lot of it actually is just driven by scale. So batteries are in many ways getting a free ride from stationary batteries for use in electricity systems are getting a bit of a free ride based on what's happening in the transport sector. So have companies like Tesla and Cattle and others making really significant investments in battery manufacturing capacity, building really big plants for the purpose of supplying electric vehicles. But as a result, batteries that you're buying for the purpose of stationary energy, as we call it, for use in the electricity sector, are coming down that cost curve very quickly, just purely as a result of the scale effects that we're starting to see in the manufacturing of batteries. So we've seen battery cell prices come down 10, 15, 20% in the last few years. That's actually generally run in parallel with the overall cost of batteries. So not just the cell prices, but the fully installed cost of batteries coming down at a similar rate. And we're expecting to see declines of 40, 50% over the next decade. And so that really, if you're looking at the economics of, can I put batteries into the energy system and can I do it in a way that doesn't significantly drive up costs for the end consumers of energy? That's really starting to change the fundamentals of those business cases.
Yes, but if you take it to the next step, would it be even more interesting? Average electric car has about 60 kilowatt hour of batteries. 1,000 car is 60 megawatt hour of batteries.
Yes.
And 1,000 car is just walking around the neighborhood in Australia, where average used to be 2.6 cars per households, right? So if you go through 40, 50 households, you have a 100 cars, right? So that battery, when will come to the grid properly through proper V2G, then you have battery embedded into the whole grid, right? Because of the transport sector you mentioned. That becomes really fascinating.
Absolutely. And I think where we're really going to start to see that having an impact is when the electric vehicles really have genuinely reached scale deployment in Australia or in any market. I think what's interesting about vehicle to grid is a lot of people think about it or talk about it in the context of a single vehicle. How would I feel as an EV owner to have a quarter, half of my battery capacity being deployed for supplying my home or supplying the local grid or something like that? And there are a lot of questions about what kind of incentives are we going to need to offer? Will EV owners be willing to participate in vehicle to grid? These sorts of questions. What I don't think people recognize is, if you fast forward to the early 2030s, when we have 5-6 million EVs on the roads or parked in driveways across the east coast of Australia, you're now talking about such a large volume of available battery capacity and available charge that you only need to tap 10% of those vehicles' capacity in order to have a meaningful impact on the supply-demand balance in the electricity grid. And I say 10% because it's a small enough number that drivers won't notice. And I'm not saying we should do it without their permission, but I'm saying once people get used to the idea that I sign up to this vehicle to grid program, but they don't even seem to use my battery because I get in every morning and my battery is still mostly charged. That's the point where I really think the potential of vehicle to grid starts to come into its own. The idea that we could be using 75% of a vehicle's battery for the purposes of grid support, we're never going to be doing that. But when you get the sort of capacity that's deployed out there, which, as I say, is really at that tipping point where you get to genuine scale, that's where the potential becomes really significant. And that's what you are starting to see is really strong programs and incentives being offered around how can we accelerate that transition to electric vehicles, because I think people with that long-term end game in mind think, how do I get 1 million EVs on the road as fast as I possibly can? How do I get 2 million on the roads as fast as I possibly can? Because that's really when this resource becomes significant.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that is not very far away. Solar panel installation, people still had to rely on technical guys coming to the roof. You're not sure. People understand cars.
Yes.
People get into a car saying it's okay. And of course, electric car driving is different, but it does not take months to get used to. You get into a friend's car and say, hey, this is nice. Okay, I can get one, right?
Yeah.
So when the penny drops, people will move very fast. And that's what is happening in Australia already, right? Electric vehicle penetration.
I think that's absolutely right. I think the main barriers that we're still needing to see a little bit of work to address at the moment is actually the supporting infrastructure. So particularly public charging infrastructure, because what we see in the research is that as many as, I think there was a recent study that suggested it was around 35 or 40% of Australians were looking to purchase an EV in the next 3 to 5 years, that would be a very rapid tipping point. But when you ask them what the barriers are, they're all related to charging. How will I be able to charge my vehicle? What if I don't have off-street parking? Will there be charging available at my destination? Will it be harder for me to plan my trips? That sort of thing. And so I think what we're starting to see is a real shift in thinking from, do I need to offer subsidies for the purchase of an EV, to governments thinking about what do I need to do to really make sure we're rolling out charging infrastructure and rolling it out as fast and as widely as we possibly can. Because if we can target some of those charging anxieties, that will be the thing that really drives the tipping point. That and having a good range of EVs available for purchase. But it feels like we're making more progress on that in the last 12 months.
Yes, I think this range anxiety, something that the fossil fuel industry created. I have a Model Y in Sydney, and the first drive I did was from Sydney to Sunshine Coast, which is more than 1,000 kilometers, as you know.
Yes.
We did more than a year back. But the point is, our car gets charged. Mostly my wife drives once a week, and it gets charged at home. Just connect, leave it overnight like the mobile phone you do. And occasionally you go to supermarket to charge. Now those free slots are no longer available. That used to be early days. You just put into charge 22K, it gets charged within a couple of hours, full charge. But the bit that intrigues me is average person uses 15 kilowatt hour a day on an average. If you have a large swimming pool that needs heating, maybe 20, but 15 is a good number. Your electric car has a 60 kilowatt hour battery sitting there. And if you have 2 cars on an average, you have 120 kilowatt hour battery, more than a week's consumption that the home needs.
Yes.
And if they're all connected to the grid, bring a collecting system they can share amongst themselves, possibly. The grid owners and operators should be worried, no? So there is a lot of strategic thing going on here, investment-wise.
I'm not sure that worried is the right way that I
No,
would
not
be
worried. A stranded
thinking about
asset
it.
could be an issue later on, no?
Potentially, yes. Yeah, and I can see why people have that consideration.
Mm-hmm.
My view is that there will always be benefits of being able to share electricity with your neighbor or with others on your street, particularly for times when You have extended droughts in renewable production, whether that's a week of cloudy days, which means that it's hard for you to be charging up your EVs based on your rooftop solar panels. There will always be some value in being able to pool those resources and share them with others in your area. What I think we are going to see a lot more of the rise of what we refer to as net zero communities. So these are areas where that pooling effect of being able to share energy between a number of neighbors on your street or in your local area means that you have areas of the grid that are a lot less reliant on the bulk supply from the transmission system. So you're still using the distribution network, but where previously it was all about a centralized system, all of your energy comes from big power plants and it runs through your transmission lines and goes through your bulk supply point to your distribution lines and out to your homes. The role of the grid really changes, where the distribution network actually becomes the focal point of being able to do that sharing and balancing locally in your local area. And the transmission network almost becomes your backup. On some days, you don't need it at all. On some days where the local supply and the local battery capacity has been exhausted or is limited, you might need to draw more from the central system. But that's a very different way of thinking about grids to the way that we've done it previously, where we used to have a hierarchy where transmission was the most important, and then the distribution networks were seen as the last mile, relatively simple role to play, just make sure it gets to the household. I think all of that is changing really significantly, Sahil, and the ability of distribution networks to understand those local flows and to balance those local flows gets much more significant.
Yeah, I think that's when it gets even more interesting in terms of policy and strategy. All of Australia's, of course, Victoria was privatized first, and then across the state. These large network assets are regulated businesses. So they have a regulatory asset base. You multiply by a rate of return, and then you get your revenue. And on that basis, some of those have been privatized and listed and whatnot. And these are very long asset base, like 25 years, 35 years. So that means if more and more people evade the system, lack of a better word, those who will remain has to pay higher amount. So this will make interesting. I like your net zero communities. So you invested in inner Sydney, and suddenly the affluent class says, oh, no, we can all manage ourselves. We don't need the grid. Who pays for the grid in future? No, these are serious policy thinking, no?
They're definitely serious policy questions, and it needs to shape the way that network owners make decisions about some of the investments that they're making. So a lot of this ability to peer into the crystal ball and to think about what the future will look like gets very important when you're making asset investment decisions for assets that, as you say, will have a 30, 50-year life. You really need to be confident that the way that the grid is going to be used in future by customers is going to support the kind of investment decisions that you're making. But it's interesting you say inner city Sydney, because the areas where we're actually seeing this happening fastest is mostly in regional areas. So it is communities in parts of regional New South Wales where it's a lot easier to say, this is the community of 100 people or 1,000 people with this kind of single large connection to the grid, where it's easier to see as rooftop solar rises, as more and more batteries get installed at a local level, that there is this, you can actually watch the trend lines over time of how much energy is being drawn down from the bulk supply point to supply that community, and how that changes over time as more and more self-consumption and self-production and sharing starts to happen within that community.
Yeah, the reason I mentioned inner Sydney or North Shore, because the cost of the battery becomes relatively insignificant compared with the price of the houses there, right? So
yes.
And then larger houses. So what happened, it's ultimately it becomes the issue of the poorer people will be left with the grid because they won't be able to the first investing into the new technologies. That has to be taken into account later on. long term.
Yeah, I agree. I do think there's some truth in that, but I think that's where some of the investments that we've started to see recently in community batteries actually really help to change that narrative, because the challenge with batteries at the moment is, as you say, they are relatively expensive still, and you can very quickly wind up in a haves and have-nots situation, like we saw with rooftop solar in some of the early days, where
Yep.
there are benefits to the individual from investing in solar, but if I'm needing to spend 20 grand up front in order to reduce my electricity bills, that's something that, only affluent households are able to do. And that's where I think some of the work that we're seeing with community batteries or neighborhood batteries, where it's a pooled investment, generally at the moment being made by a distribution network, but then offering battery capacity to and the benefits of a local battery to all of the electricity consumers in that area, not just the ones who can afford to put a battery behind the meter in their own home, becomes a way of addressing that.
Oh, that's fascinating, especially for second life batteries, because lithium batteries have 3 lives, right? The first life, the electric car, where you need to get in 200 kilometers in X seconds. But then later on, home don't demand that fast discharge. So those batteries will find places in homes, especially it would be good to put them into community batteries so that if some cells are not working, that risk gets distributed. Tell
Yes.
a little bit more about community battery. This is something that should happen globally, especially in developing Asia, to provide reliability in distribution systems, no?
Yes, absolutely. So we've been doing quite a bit of work with distribution networks on understanding the role of community batteries. And as you say, at the moment, a lot of the focus has been on the energy arbitrage. So can I soak up solar in that community during the middle of the day, and then can I resupply it at night? But what we're actually seeing increasingly is there are multiple opportunities for community batteries to play a role, or multiple business cases that you can create. One of them is that arbitrage business case, but there's also a really strong case for using these batteries to support reliability, especially in fringe of grid areas where you do have a single connection point to the wider grid, and so you're at risk of having frequent outages if that power line goes down, which is something that we do see in parts of remote and rural Australia, but equally it's something you see in a number of other countries around the world, where you have these sort of long, stringy electricity grids. Is the role of batteries as a cost-effective way of providing some of that resilience to local communities and allowing them to maybe not ride out a blackout completely, but certainly to provide more energy for longer, particularly for critical systems or critical needs within that community, is really becoming significant.
Yes, and especially if you dig deep enough and bury these batteries underground, then it's weatherproof, right?
Yes.
Your distribution infrastructure, every time there is a typhoon, fires and whatnot, it's exposed if it's underground.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And we're starting to see some of those investments, particularly in some of the Pacific Island nations, but also actually, very interestingly, in New Zealand as well. We've been working with clients in New Zealand who are planning some of the energy networks in New Zealand that are planning the next stage of investments. And they are the challenges that they've had around significant blackouts because of extreme weather events over the last couple of years in New Zealand have really shaped the thinking of both the grid owners and the regulators there, to say, maybe we need to be thinking much more about local supply and local resilience, and what do microgrids or standalone power systems have to offer, so that if you do have something that knocks out a big transmission line, the community stays resilient to those sort of outcomes.
Yes, it's just a mindset issue when we shifted from mainframe to PCs.
Yes, it's the same thinking that's happening, and it's very interesting seeing a lot of network engineers who have come from that mainstream thinking of it's all a centralized system, and if you want resilience, you just need to build a second power line. The attitude to a lot of energy system planning is N-1. The way that I ensure resilience is by making sure that I always have a second line that I can rely on if the first one gets knocked over. But what we're seeing increasingly as climate change drives more extreme weather events is that N-1 is not enough. And the cost of delivering an electricity system that has N-2 or N-3 levels of redundancy in order to be truly or attempt to be truly resilient to these widespread extreme weather events is just prohibitively high. Whereas more distributed, localized energy in the form of standalone power systems and so forth actually achieves that resilience much more cost effectively.
Yes, actually, you gave me an idea. Just thinking through the mainframe analogy, mainframe to PCs, then everything went to cloud. So if it is like a centralized generation bring electricity, maybe we are now into rooftop solar. It's like a PC. And then if you have underground embedded batteries everywhere into the network, that may be the cloud, right? It's your community batteries, right?
Yes, absolutely. So I think that's a big part of what the future looks like, Sahil. And the shift in battery economics is really going to support that, as well as Second Life. You're absolutely right. That's going to be a really significant part of all of this, is thinking about what does the life cycle of a battery look like? Where does it spend its middle age? Where does it spend its retirement? And what do we do when it's finally time to decommission to make sure that we're achieving resource recovery is going to be a really important part of this, because batteries are going to be everywhere in the energy system of the future.
Now it's so many things happening. What else you do, Jeff Forrest? Otherwise, Jeff, you'll be very much into work. It's a fascinating front you are in, no? What do you do for fun, other than work?
What do I do for fun? So I have two young daughters, and so a lot of my fun times is shaped by what they're excited about. So I am, as you can probably tell by my accent, I'm a Canadian who has spent most of his life in Australia. And so I have put a lot of effort into making sure my daughters understand some of their Canadian heritage. So teaching them ice skating at a very young age has been important. And so we spend a lot of time out visiting Sydney's ice rinks, the few that there are, and doing skating lessons and skating practice and that sort of thing. Apart from that, getting out and enjoying this beautiful country in terms of bushwalking and hiking and so forth is a really important way, I think, to stay connected with the local landscape and to have some time to think deep thoughts.
That's amazing. Yeah. Because I think that's the bit very important, to be able to connect, and especially looking at your daughter's face, that am I living it the same way that I got it? No?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's for so many people working in this sector, that is now the driving force, is you're working on assets and systems that will outlive your career. And so how do we set things up well for the future? How do we make decisions now that people in 30, 40, 50 years are proud of the decisions that we made, proud of the diligence that we went to, and that my daughters can grow up in a world that still lets them go ice skating and still lets them go bushwalking, and they get to enjoy all of the benefits that we do today.
So what you would tell a young entrepreneur who sort of thinking to get into the battery industry, the whole energy industry, battery being just the driving force, where you see the opportunities, like for your young daughters saying, okay, Dad, what should I do? I like to be like you, but where do I start?
Yes, they're probably a little bit young to be launching their startups just now, but I think when I'm talking to investors today, I see the greatest opportunities right now at the fringe of the grid. So the way the energy system interacts with a lot of the devices and resources that we have behind the meter is something that is a journey that we are only just starting on at the moment, particularly in Australia, where a lot of the work that we have around flexibility markets and so forth is still relatively immature compared to what we see in Europe and some of the other markets around the world. And that means that there's tremendous opportunity for new businesses and new technology platforms to shape that market and to do well out of that. And that potential around flexibility and coordination is really significant in terms of our ability to, the electricity sector has always been about matching supply and demand. And we've talked a lot about the role of batteries in helping to shape and better manage the supply side, but the ability of technology platforms to really drive flexibility on the demand side is going to be a huge part of the next decade of our energy system. And I think that's really where a lot of the untapped opportunity is. So when I talk to new entrepreneurs, it's probably less on the battery side and more on the flexibility and coordination side, because that's where I really think some of the biggest opportunities are.
Yeah, because battery is a tool. You have to see what services it can create, right?
Yes, absolutely.
How do you keep yourself updated? What resources do you use? I know that your job brings you all the knowledge, but in general, people want to be up to date on what's happening in Australia's energy sector,
Sure.
especially. What you suggest?
So there are a few media outlets that I generally try and stay across every day. So in addition to some of the major media outlets, Renew Economy is always a great resource in terms of what's happening in the energy sector. For those who like to go a bit deeper on the technical side of the grid, What Clarity is actually a great newsletter service that looks at things like how I was reading an article last night that was talking about how battery auto bidding technology had responded to some high system price events in the last week. And so if you really want to understand how the technology and the economics interact with one another, which I think is really the focus of a lot of the work that we do, those sorts of resources are really good. But outside of that, I think a lot of it actually comes from talking to your network, whether that's in face-to-face conversations such as this or through resources like LinkedIn. There are definitely pockets of the social media networks that are filled with energy nerds, and I consider myself an energy nerd, so I really enjoy interacting with them.
Is there anything else? We know conversation went this way, that we didn't plan anything specific, but is there anything specific you would like to share and highlight?
Probably only one thing, which is that this is actually quite a significant morning for us to be discussing all of this on, because we've just this morning released a major report in partnership with Energy Networks Australia that's looking at the role of the distribution grid and of distribution connected resources. So that includes everything that happens in the consumer household and behind the meter. The report is called The Time Is Now, and it's about seizing the opportunities that we have from that more decentralized part of the energy system to support our decarbonization of the electricity sector. And so it's a very significant piece of work for us, and we're very proud to be releasing it today. So it would be a mistake for me not to mention it, and I would urge your listeners to go and have a look for it. So if you search for L.E.K Consulting and Energy Networks Australia, The Time Is Now, you should be able to find it.
Wow. We are talking about those things without any guidelines, but I think what I might do, I'll read the report, and maybe in a month's time or a few months' time, let's have another conversation, because I think it would be very useful to understand in a structured way what's happening, no?
Sure, that would be terrific. Yeah, I would love to talk about it.
So Jeff, how can people reach you? Anybody wants to connect?
The best way to reach me is to find me on LinkedIn. So yeah, if you search for Jeff Forrest on LinkedIn, as I said, I'm always excited to connect with people who have an interest in the energy sector. And I'm very active there and, talking to people and interacting with my networks. So I'm very happy to connect with people and to have discussions about what they're passionate about and what I'm passionate about, which is all things energy. So yeah, if you search for Jeff Forrest on LinkedIn, you should be able to find me very easily.
Thank you so much. I really learned quite a lot from you, and thank you for your time today. And I'm sure definitely we'll connect again.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me on the podcast, Sahil. It was really great chatting to you.
Thank you. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Energypreneurs. To continue listening to this conversation, please visit us at Energypreneurs. Thank you. See you next time.